Hey guys, welcome back to part 7 of the 10-part intro to Java programming tutorial for beginners. If you're enjoying this video, please go ahead and give it a like. If you have any comments, questions, suggestions, leave them down below. And in the previous video, we discussed conditionals, so we learned a little bit about if and else statements, and we were able to control the output by what we did there. And in this video, we're just going to talk about classes. So we're going to do a deep dive into classes, learn a little bit about libraries, and then we'll go ahead and start building our calculator class. So what is a class? So a class is a defined structure of code that contains things like variables and methods, which we have already written. So essentially, if we look at our main, or rather our hello world class, we see that we have things like methods here. We also have some variables, some defined variables. So it's a way to contain and organize your code. So now let's just move over to this notepad here and let's just dive in and kind of explain why this is important. So suppose we want to define an employee at a company. So I'll draw here just an employee at some company. And if we want to essentially define what an employee is, we know that an employee can have things like a name, they can have an employee ID, they can have things like their age, position, department. So they have all these different attributes. And imagine if we just go back to our code really quickly and we want to define a person or an employee, we would have to just copy all the stuff over again and over again to create new employees. So one of the beauties about classes is that we can say, hey, this is an employee and this is a blueprint or a template for an employee. So we'll just call this an employee. And within that, we can have all these variables that define what an employee is. So an employee, again, can have these attributes: ID, name, age, position, department, and they can also have different actions, right? So they can have things like receive pay or, get their name, get their age, and things like that, so that we don't have to repeat this code over and over again. So once we create this employee, we can now say, hey, I can now create as many employees as I want. I defined a blueprint for an employee. So suppose now we have 2 employees. We'll call them John for the first employee, and we'll call the next one Sarah. Now we can say, hey, John is an employee. Sarah is also an employee. So in Java, we can do something called instantiate an object or just create an instance of an employee. And essentially what we're doing is creating an object. And these are some terms that you'll hear thrown around. We're just saying, hey, John is an employee and we want to create an object of employee for John, and we also want to do the same thing for Sarah. So in Java, the syntax for that looks something like the following. We would define and say, this is the class that we want to use, employee. Then we would create the variable name, very similar to how we've done in the past with our variables here. We define the type of variable that it is, an int, a string, and the list goes on and on. Then we define the name of the variable, and then after the equal sign, we have to declare what that value is. So in order for us to create an object, we would do the same thing. We'll say, hey, John is an employee. Then we give John a variable name, so we'll just say that it's John. And in Java, again, we will say this equals, and now we're going to learn a new keyword, which is new. And that is the keyword, it's new. And this new keyword allows us to create or instantiate objects of a specific type. So if we create an employee John, then on the right hand side, we also have to say this is a new employee and open and close parentheses. And now for Sarah, we would do the same thing. We would simply just say, hey, this is an employee, and we will call this employee Sarah. And then we will say new. So this is the new term that we have to get used to. And we will instantiate an object of type employee. So we're just saying, hey, John is an employee, Sarah's an employee, and I want to create a new employee. So this would be our class. And then these here would be our objects. So this is a class. This defines the structure, the variables, the methods. Now we can reuse this class and we could create hundreds, thousands. It doesn't matter what the number is. We could create as many employees as we want, and we can reuse the same code. Now, one thing to remember here is that some classes, if it's not your main class, will require something called a constructor. So I'll just very quickly introduce that. A constructor, and you will see this, I'll leave some reading down below, essentially will allow you to create an object. So in Java, we see this new keyword, then we see employee, and then we see this open and close parenthesis. Java will then say, hey, do you have a constructor as part of your class? So now we're gonna just draw a little arrow here, and we know in Java that our classes look something like this class with open and closed braces. And then within that, we have our variables and our methods. Java will say, if you're using this new keyword with a type of object, then we need something called a constructor. And a constructor, the syntax for that is just going to be public and then the name of the class. So it's going to be employee, and then you can have it take any arguments. So this is very similar to our previous tutorial on methods that we had before. If you haven't seen that one, I'll leave a link right above. And we can define ways to create employees. So we can say, hey, I want to pass a specific ID or a name in order to create an employee. So we can say, hey, I want whenever you create a new employee, I want you to give this person a name. So we'll just say in here, we can just write in string and then name. So now if we have this in our class, and by the way, I actually made a mistake here. The class should also be called employee. So remember that our classes should be named accordingly. And then we have this thing called a constructor to create an employee. And we will take an argument of string name, and then we will set that name later on. So I'll show you how to do that once we switch back to the code. So that is just a basic overview on classes. And this should make more sense now that we're going to move on to our calculator example in the code. So we're going to go ahead and switch over to this. And one thing we can do is if you wrote out the calculator class, please go ahead and open that. So I'm just going to double press shift, and shift will bring up the a search bar for us. And then we can type in calculator.java, and we see that it comes up right here. And then we can just go ahead and open that. So now that we have our class, we wrote here a bunch of different methods, and we have our class, but there's no way that we can create an object of calculator. So if we go back to this, we know that for a class, we can have variables, we can have methods. For this calculator, we only have methods so far, and I want to create an object of type calculator, which requires this constructor. So we will add the constructor here, and we'll just say public and then calculator. Calculator, there we go. And then open and curly braces, and that should allow us to create a calculator. So it's that simple for you to create a reusable piece of code. And imagine it's a physical calculator. You can say, hey, I need a new calculator. You can bring it into your program, and then you can start using all the different methods within it. So this will make our hello world. So I'm just going to reopen hello world. So I just pressed shift just to pull up the search bar. We'll go back to hello world, and we see here that we have all these methods within our hello world, and it's kind of a bit messy in a way. Since we have all these methods, we can have things like do this and do that, and eventually it could just get out of hand. So let's keep everything contained. And this is one of the beauties of programming, is kind of defining different types and objects. And we're just going to delete these methods now, since we have our calculator class. And we're going to go to the next line here, and we will create our very first, keep this within the main method for now. We're going to create or instantiate our very first object. So remember what the syntax for that looks like. We need the type, we need a variable name, we need this new keyword, and then finally we need the name of the class and open and close parentheses. So we created a constructor within the calculator class, and we now need to instantiate this object. So we'll say calculator, and we can just call it calculator if we want to. And we'll say equals new calculator, open and close parenthesis, semicolon. And we just instantiated an object of type calculator. So now we have a calculator. And one of the cool things about this is that, again, we can now use all the methods within a calculator. So if we open up our calculator, we'll see we have add and subtract and multiply and divide, and it's very clear exactly what we're using. So if we go back to hello world, we'll see we have a calculator, and we created a new calculator. So now we can say, I would like to, and we'll say that here, I would like to add two numbers. So the way you access methods is by using the dot operator. So in Java, if you would like to access methods within the class, you just call the variable name and then you add a dot. So if we look here, we know that we have an employee. If we wanted to access its ID, name, age, position, we would just say John.id to get John's ID. If we wanted John's name, we would just say John.name. So it's the same thing here. For calculator, we can say calculator.add, and then IntelliJ is smart enough to tell us exactly what it is that we wrote in our method. We want to add two integers, so we can just say calculator.add, and we'll say add 3 and 7. So we know that 3 and 7 is 10 if we add. So for now, we'll just do this, and we can store that into a variable. So remember, if we go back to our calculator class, we know that there's a return type here of int. So remember, Java will look for this to know what to return, and add returns an integer. So we will need to specify that this is an int back in our hello world class. So we can say, hey, add these two numbers, and this is going to return the result 10 in integer. So we can say that this int result is equal to calculator.add 3 and 7. And we know this should be 10. So one way that we can verify that this is correct is we can say system.out.print line, and then we can say print result. And remember, the print will, if we define a variable, it'll print the value of that variable. So this should print out 10, and we can add a string here and just say the result is, and then we'll know that it's 10. So we can, for now, comment these out. So again, I'm just pressing Command/, and this should just comment the stuff out. That way we don't see it in the output. You can erase it if you want, no big deal. For now, I'll just do this. But essentially, we created a calculator object. We instantiated an object of type calculator, and we called the method by using dot, and we stored our result into a variable called result, and then we're printing out the result. And this cleans up a lot of the code. So we removed all the methods that we had down here, and now let's go ahead and run it. So I'll just go ahead and press the play button up here again, run hello world.main, and then we should see the result. So I'll pull this up, and if we look here, the result is 10, which is exactly what we were expecting down here. So that kind of takes care of classes, what they are, what they do, how to instantiate, how to call methods. So there's a lot in this tutorial. I'll leave some links down below so you guys can do some further reading. But if you guys have any questions, feel free to leave a comment down below. If you're enjoying this, please go ahead and share it with your friends, whoever's learning some programming. And in the next tutorial, we will start to use Java's built-in libraries. So libraries are essentially just packages of a bunch of different classes similar to this calculator class that we created. And we will use their code to read input from a file. And we will create an input file. We will be able to read in the file line by line, and then we will do some manipulation with that. So stay tuned for the next one. Again, always a pleasure. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.